Tales of a Hitman.
On this occasion, we have changed some locations and names to avoid harming or involving anyone. I've lived so many experiences in the woods and the mountains that I could write an entire book about all the paranormal situations that occurred during training and some conflicts with rivals. Today, I'll share some of them with you, hoping you'll enjoy them.
Are you ready for this?
Before anything else, it's important for you to know how I got into this profession. Like the majority of people or colleagues, we ended up here out of necessity, hunger, and in my case, to help my brothers and my mother since my father died during a raid at a plantation, as you can probably imagine. My father was friends with the person in charge of crop collection, so as soon as they heard about my father's passing, they wasted no time inviting me to work with them. We had earned their trust, and they knew us well. I returned home with some doubts about the invitation, but what could I do? Now I was the man of the house. My mother had tears in her eyes and told me not to do it, warning me that I might end up like my father or even worse. I found myself in a complex dilemma because I couldn't let my family die of hunger. So, I had to take the path to protect my family. The next day, when I arrived at the field, I noticed Jonas was already sitting under the shade of a tree by the roadside. I knew he was there to get my answer, so I tried to negotiate as best as I could. We all know that once you get into this, getting out is nearly impossible. Jonas said to me, "What's up, buddy? Have you thought about what I told you the other day? Have you decided to lift your family out of misery, or will you stay a laborer forever? Remember, some are born to labor and others to sell. This is your chance." He also mentioned that they had known my dad for a long time, and the boss admired his honesty and straightforwardness. My father earned his place through hard work and responsibility, and that's why they were here for me. Jonas gave me the choice to decide whether I'd join or end it right there. I tried to convince him to let my brothers continue working for the boss in the fields, and once I became the best at what I did, I would retire them. This profession is hereditary, and I didn't want my mother or brothers to be pressured in the future. When I achieved a position of power, I wanted to take them away from the town. Luckily, the boss accepted my proposal. So, I would soon begin my training to become the best at whatever they assigned me to do. It was during this time that the paranormal experiences began, spanning 30 years of doing everything, and when I say everything, I mean everything. My first paranormal experience happened during a guerrilla tactics practice. In simple terms, we were being trained on how to defend ourselves at night, in the jungle, amid the dense vegetation and darkness, illuminated only by the moonlight and some self-made sounds. Another crucial point to mention is that just as the Army is aware of new techniques and technologies, so are we. That's why, on that occasion, the boss hired someone quite important and renowned for combat tactics, torture, and internal security. Frankly, with that person, I learned what a human is capable of to maintain control over territory and keep the competition in check. That night, we were practicing techniques that involved dividing the team, a kind of personnel distribution that gradually surrounded the target. Before we began, one of our superiors jokingly warned us to beware of the witches in the area. He said that on previous occasions, they had caused teams to shoot each other. As our superior explained that night, a witch had supposedly taken the form of a knight. They quickly identified him as a stranger to the team and radioed to inquire about the characteristics of that individual. Indeed, he didn't belong to the group. The pursuit began, and that witch played with the minds of our comrades, causing some to shoot their own teammates. One witness affirmed that the witch had stood right in front of him, and despite the colleague's insistence that he should stop and explain his presence, the dark figure merely stared at him intently. Suddenly, the giant shadow lunged at him, and our colleague had no choice but to fire his weapon. When the creature reached him, it vanished completely. Once the mist dissipated, our colleague saw at a distance that a lump had fallen to the ground. With some fear, he approached to see if he had hit the target, and when he arrived, he realized that it was his own teammate lying on the ground. It didn't just happen to him. Other members mentioned similar occurrences, actions that led them to shoot their fellow team members. We would later be shown the place where they had to dig and bury them. They saw us as valueless objects. What disturbed us even more was that the local fauna had dug, and, with the help of the superior's lamp, we could see some remains like hands and a skull that, as you can imagine, no longer had any skin or soft tissue. As best as we could, we covered the hole while holding our noses and mouths because, as you can imagine, the smell was far from pleasant. After this brief warning, we started our training, and I felt that, like me, some of my comrades felt as if someone was following or watching us throughout the exercise. The minutes felt like an eternity, but none of us had the luxury of feeling afraid, as we were all competing to climb the ranks or levels. A few extra bucks in the wallet never hurt anyone. Some comrades decide to entrust themselves to the Santa Muerte, Saint Death, others to the generous bandit or the crazier one known as Nazario, but I chose to stick with the father of the entire universe, especially when all those paranormal events occurred, which we will unravel throughout this document. I want to clarify that I don't feel nor am I a good person. I know that at some point, I'll have to pay for everything I've done, and believe me, I have no regrets. You'll also understand that anyone who decides to take this path knows what they're getting into. We finished quite tired but very pleased with the results of the exam. To celebrate, our superior had prepared dinner for us, and as you know, some beers couldn't be missing to toast and finally take the next step in our training. After drinking and dining, we prepared to rest since the next day would involve some practices with clubs and paralyzing belts. I can't describe everything else, but I know you can imagine it perfectly well, methods to make people talk. Each one chose where to spend the night, so we settled into rest while the lower-ranking members kept watch that night. We never imagined who we would face later on. I think it was around 2 in the morning when a fellow comrade's screams woke us up alarmingly. At first, we felt that our security had been compromised, so we grabbed our tools of the trade to defend ourselves. We quickly followed the sound of our comrade, who kept screaming alarmingly. We formed a formation and went to his rescue, only to realize that something or someone was pulling him by the feet through the grass. Our comrade managed to grab onto a small tree, but that thing kept pulling him. One of our team members started firing shots at that shadow, which seemed like something out of a horror movie. When the lamps illuminated it, the form vanished as if it were mist or smoke. But things didn't end there. We began to hear laughter that changed position as if jumping from one tree to another. We quickly grabbed our comrade and hurried back to the camp while those laughs kept changing places. An odd thing was that our friend seemed quite weak, as if all his energy had been drained. He couldn't walk. We had to support him, another member, and me. But the most terrifying part comes now. Suddenly, those laughter among the trees ceased to be heard, but we could clearly feel that something heavy fell to the ground. We looked in the direction where the sound came from and noticed that the grass was rapidly opening towards us, but there was no one to aim at. You might think I'm crazy, but my comrades and I know what happened to us that night. Seconds later, that strange force began again to try to take our comrade away. We had to hold him between several of us because that entity or which had tremendous strength. It felt like hitting or impacting something that you can't see or something beyond human comprehension. Little by little, we gained ground until that dark being left our comrade alone. I have to admit that none of us slept for the rest of the night. We thought we had escaped those witches that night, but no, we were very wrong. They waited until we were vulnerable to play their tricks. It's time to subscribe and activate the bell. You would help us a lot. Years later, the next paranormal incident happened to us on the road. That night, we had to guard a heavy shipment, so as usual, we followed the cargo at a safe distance to avoid drawing attention. We were a little behind schedule, so the truck driver started going a bit faster. After a few hours, we spotted a woman walking along the roadside in the distance. We thought nothing of it, as it's quite common to encounter people with mental health issues on the roads in the state. We started joking about the situation since it was clear that the person had long and unkempt hair, walked barefoot, and gazed downward while her hands were intertwined around her belly. "Look, it's your old lady Cheo. Tell her you let her work in peace, send her home," I said to the truck driver with a smile as we continued our way. A few minutes later, things took a dark turn as that woman appeared again on the roadside. We fell silent for a few seconds because not long ago, we had left her behind. A chilling feeling ran through our bodies when that woman turned to look at us, her eyes resembling those of dogs or cats when you shine a light on them. The worst part was when she started screaming, but her voice wasn't normal. It had a disturbing guttural sound. Out of nowhere, that woman started running at a frightening speed, and to this day, we can't explain how she managed to catch up with us. She jumped and grabbed onto my side while showing us her mouth with rotted teeth and a tongue that was far from normal. I pulled out my tool of the trade and didn't hesitate to use it several times, even though we were left partially deaf and with discomfort for several weeks. But that horrific woman seemed completely unaffected. The projectiles did nothing to her. It was as if the bullets passed right through that thing. I can't deny that. Despite how tough we are, we screamed on some occasions because that thing wouldn't get off the vehicle. To make matters worse, after the glass broke from the shots, it stuck its face inside while moving its oversized tongue in all directions. I tried to land some punches on that thing, but my fists only hit the door frame. It was like punching through mist, something very similar to cotton candy, but extremely terrifying. I attempted to open the door to throw it onto the pavement, and just as we passed across on the roadside, that woman disappeared. After calming down a bit and a few days later when the ringing in our ears had subsided, we were able to talk and concluded that the woman possibly died at that location. We try to be strong in many things because that's what we're trained for, but how do you fight against supernatural things that truly exist? The last horror story will leave you thinking tonight, so enjoy this broadcast. The next paranormal incident involves people with the ability to transform into different animals. I also used to think they were mere legends or hallucinations of the elderly since my father had told me about some quite strange situations involving these beings commonly known as nawalis. That night, we were guarding a merchandise production as the authorities had recently raided some stations in the vicinity. The product was in constant motion, so we couldn't afford to stop producing. It would mean losses for the boss, and we'd get into serious trouble. The workload for those working in production was quite heavy, and they couldn't afford to take time off to go home and eat something. I selected some guys, and we went down from the mountains to take them for dinner. We got some aguachiles and shrimp empanadas and soon set out on our way back to the base. We arrived and fed all the workers. They finished their meals, and one man around 40 or 45 years old asked for permission to go to the bathroom. For security reasons, no one can wander alone at that time. We don't know if they are informants or if the security has been compromised in some way, so I accompanied him to make sure he genuinely needed to relieve himself. I gave him about 15 or 20 meters to continue, and he positioned himself behind the first tree he found. A few seconds later, I heard him vomiting and making some quite strange sounds. I quickly approached him to see what was happening. When I was about 5 meters away from him, I noticed quite disturbing things. I saw his hand, and the nails were quite large, something they hadn't been seconds before. His voice transformed from cries of pain to pig-like and human sounds. Just as I stood in front of him, he looked at me, and my body froze for a few seconds. When that person turned his face towards me, I identified a pair of large fangs like those of a wild boar. His nose also showed a rather strange swelling. As soon as I grabbed my tool, this person jumped into the underbrush, but now on all fours. I heard him move away from me, trying to escape. I quickly communicated with the team to try to stop him or see what he had turned into. One of the guys had the opportunity to fire some shots at that creature, but it didn't stop. The next day, we found his clothes in the direction of the nearest town. We asked the workers who this person was, trying to identify him and pay him a visit to understand what it was all about, but it was not possible. The guy said he had only started working with us recently and was an undocumented person from the southern part of the state. We never heard from that person again, but I can vouch for the fact that the nawalis still exist among us. The last experience I will tell you about this time seems straightforward, but it's not. Many of us have heard horror stories about La Llorona and the horrible things that happen regarding this topic, but my horror story surpasses the classic events related to it. That night, we were in the town guarding the boss. He was attending a very important meeting, so we had to wait for him to finish. It was around 3 in the morning when I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a woman at the corner of the street. Her body emerged from under a tree, camouflaging herself. I quickly communicated it through the radio because I didn't want to be taken by surprise. Sometimes the opposing team resorts to so many tricks, like using children, elderly people, and of course, women. As soon as I gave the alert, we started hearing some lamentations. That thing wasn't saying, "Oh, my children," like everyone tells it. I feel it's alive because we all heard wailing, like of pain. Quite the opposite of searching for her children. Everyone had already located that woman, but we started to get a bit nervous when we saw her walking or floating towards us. Something quite disturbing was that whenever her silhouette passed under a streetlight, her body would disappear, only to reappear when darkness fell. As I mentioned before, we are trained to overcome many things, but not the paranormal. However, I can tell you that many bosses in this line of work have the habit of performing protective rituals and other things that I might tell you about later. That woman kept advancing, and her wail sounded closer with each passing moment. Another myth I had heard was that the further you hear her, the closer she is, and vice versa, but it's not always true. That thing was getting closer, and it was clear that the sound increased as the apparition moved in front of us on the other side of the street. Based on my previous experience on the road, as I mentioned earlier, I grabbed my St. Benedict medal and crossed myself while watching that floating silhouette of a woman pass in front of the trucks. She continued straight ahead for a few more blocks until she dissolved. As soon as the boss came out, we told him what had happened, but, of course, he didn't believe us. I hope you enjoyed these horror stories. Don't forget to subscribe, give us a thumbs up, activate the notification bell, and share with your friends. See you in the next broadcast of Dark Secret.